We are joined by the author of The War on Football, Daniel J. Flynn. Daniel, thank you for coming on. Appreciate it.
Hey, thank you for having me.
I guess we should start with your book. Tell me a little bit about The War on Football.
Yeah, I decided to write The War on Football when I came across a study by the National Institutes for Occupational Safety and Health in the United States. The NFL Players Association asked the federal government to do a mortality study on their players because there was such a huge, there was a big perception in the United States that football players die young, and the perception amongst CFL players that they die young. Mm-hmm. And they did this study on every player who played between 1959 and 1988, and they found that not only did football players not only die young, but they were vastly outliving their peers in society. The scientists expected an 18% death rate. They found a 10% death rate. Rates of cancer, heart disease, respiratory illness was dramatically lower. And I think what was really shocking to the Players Association is that the rate of suicide amongst NFL players was dramatically lower than the rate in American society. And so there's a lot of myths going on around about football. That's sort of the takeaway I got from the study.
Right.
And that people, will repeat those myths without reference to the actual science.
I remember, and I'm trying to get it in my head right now, but I remember reading a Sports Illustrated years ago that said this kind of oft-repeat number that you're speaking about the life expectancy of football players to be between 55 and 58. Now, I'm going to do the quick Google and try and find it. But have you heard that? Is that one of the things that you kind of...
Yeah.
Yeah?
I mean, I kept hearing that. I mean, that's something that Malcolm Gladwell has repeated on national television. It's something that George Will, who's the most read columnist in America, repeated in a column last August. Mm-hmm. LZ Granderson, who's a big columnist for ESPN.com, it had a life of its own. And so they did the actual study, and they found out that football players live longer, that they don't kill themselves. And so there's a perception that's being, the public's really being primed for a certain perception by the media that players, that football equals, shorter lifespans and increased suicide. That's a lie. And so that's one of the first thing that got me going to thinking that, well, there's probably a lot more myths about football out there.
Right.
Was this NIOSH study.
Yeah, I found it's ABC who first reported that the average life expectancy of a retired football player is 58 years old. And that NIOSH study is quoted in this saying they were quite wrong, which is a really interesting starting point for this conversation. And you kind of heard my background going into it. I played football in high school. I now do college games here in Canada on television. Have you read League of Denial or seen the documentary? And what was your reaction to that information that was put forth by one of the co-authors who was on the show?
I saw the documentary. I think it put the BS in PBS, which is the public broadcasting system here in America.
Yeah, we got
it. They got the 72 minutes into the show before they even allowed a critic of theirs to come on and say anything. I thought that the fact that whenever they even referenced someone who was critical of theirs, they kept saying NFL doctor to discredit any opposing information, and yet many of the figures that they had on that documentary, including Robert Cantu and Chris Nowinski, were paid consultants to the NFL players' lawsuit against the NFL. They didn't bother to mention any of that. So I thought that the presentation was more of an emotional one than an intellectual one. And when they went faces of death on us in the first few minutes and they showed us Mike Webster's dead body, they were not making an intellectual argument. They were making an emotional one. They were trying to get us riled up. And I think what bothered me the most about the whole documentary is that the majority of scientists disagree. The majority of sports scientists, brain scientists disagree with a lot of the central premises of the documentary, of the scientists that we saw there. But if you watch that documentary, you get the impression that the folks at BU and the Benanamalu group, that they are in the mainstream. The most recent consensus statement from the International Conference on Concussion in Sport is that there is absolutely no scientific evidence showing a connection between contact sports and CTE. If you watch that documentary, you would get the impression that science believes football causes CTE. There hasn't even been a study alleging this yet.
And those who contend that oftentimes point to the studies that have been done from those two aforementioned spots were done on players who were predisposed to CTE or were showing signs of it before they passed away, and those brains were passed on. It wasn't just a random study of former football players who may or may not have, or hockey players for that matter, who may or may not have suffered concussions in their career. Is that correct?
That's right.
Yeah.
That's correct. And beyond that, those two groups that were profiled on the show, which they didn't mention, they don't even agree on what the definition of CTE is. They have a disagreement on some of the basics on what constitutes the disease. Beyond that, there's been a lot of criticism of the BU group specifically because there's a certain condition that occurs naturally, and you'll find it in about 97% of the population of older people. They're using that as an indicator to say whether someone has CTE or not.
Right.
And if that's the case, if everyone has CTE, then no one has CTE. And if they're using that, it shouldn't shock anyone that they're finding CTE in all these players' brains when their threshold for what constitutes the disease is so incredibly low. So at this point, I think there are a lot more questions than answers. And the big question is, what role does genetics play in this? Because, some of the studies from BU are finding that in the autopsies that they're doing, there's a certain genetic marker that's found in about 60% of the CTE cases. It's only found in about 25% of the general public, and this marker's been linked to Alzheimer's. So is there a genetic role in CTE?
Right, and I've oftentimes wondered that because if your father is predisposed to some sort of sport, or in this case violent sport, or maybe oftentimes, especially in my family, you gravitate to those sports as well. And I wondered if it was genetic in any way. So all your knowledge and all your information is from research that you've done. You're not a doctor, and you're not purporting to be a doctor. I just want to lay that out there for those listening.
That's absolutely correct. Yes, that's correct.
Do you believe from your research that there's doubt that concussions can cause long-term damage?
No, I don't. I think repeated concussions, I think one or two, there's no evidence that you're going to have long-term damage. And there's actually a better documentary that's been on PBS called The Smartest Team, and they had a doctor on, William Meehan from the Children's Hospital in Boston, coming out and saying, look, if you have one or two concussions, that there's not any evidence that you're going to have long-term damage. But when you start getting repeated concussions, that's time to start thinking about doing something different. That NIOSH study that we opened the broadcast discussing, one of the things they discovered was elevated rates of certain neurological disorders amongst professional football players. Initially, the rates were thought to be only a little bit elevated. They did a second study where they sort of rejigged the parameters of the study, and they found that rates for ALS and Alzheimer's were about 3 times the level for NFL players, but they were concentrated solely in skill position players. So linemen had normal rates of these diseases, but the guys who take the big hits tended to have more. So that leads me to believe that, there's at least at a certain position, at a certain skill, a certain level like the NFL, that you open yourself up to that. Now, interestingly enough, the Mayo Clinic did a study last year on football players in high school and found that the rates of neurological diseases were no different amongst these football players than amongst members of the band, the glee club, the choir. So I think the level of competition really matters, and what we should get out of this is that most people who play football are never going to make it to the NFL, and you really don't have a whole lot to worry about. But when you make it to the NFL and you play a certain position, then that's when the levels really jump for some of these diseases.
Right, and that's in no way to diminish what an actual concussion does to a human brain. If you suffer that concussion, make sure that you get off and you're tended to properly. My question for you then is, why do you think that the NFL settled a $1 billion suit with its former players?
Yeah, I'd flip the question. Why do you think that the players settled the lawsuit? They were asking for a lot more than that. I think from the NFL's perspective, it was a public relations nightmare, and it was costing them a lot of money in legal fees, so they thought, let's move on. Let's get out of this. I think what your listeners probably don't know about that suit is that 10% of the players suing the NFL never actually played a down in an NFL game, that these are guys who got cut in the preseason or may have made a practice squad. And I think that goes to show you how bogus the suit was for a lot of these guys. We should remember that NFL suit, that's been settled, but there's still a suit against the Riddell Helmet Corporation.
Right.
And when I look at a guy like Ken Stabler on the cover of Sports Illustrated in 1978 wearing a Wilson helmet, why is he suing Riddell? Why is Carl Mecklenburg, wearing a Billy Kelly, a bike helmet, in his football card and tops in the mid-'80s? Why is he suing Riddell? It's the same thing. You had guys who never played in the NFL suing the NFL. To me, that's ridiculous. You have guys who wore other manufacturers' helmets suing Riddell. To me, this shows that this, for a lot of these players, this is a money grab.
Yeah. I wish I knew the specific cases, because in the end, I mean, I know a lot of guys who got hurt in preseason back in the day and never got to play a game because they just got cut by the NFL teams. But that's another story for another day. It's an interesting look. Sorry, you're going to say something. I didn't want to cut you off there.
No, the one guy I would point to is a guy like White, Pat White, the quarterback, who earlier this year was suing the NFL because he alleged he got brain damage. Then he was offered a contract to play for the Washington Redskins. He drops his suit. He signs a contract to play in the game that he says caused him all these brain injuries. I mean, to me, that shows you right there that, there are guys out there who want to make a buck, and if they can't make the buck from the lawsuit, they'll get back into the league in a second.
Yeah. Or they just love the game. One of the two. But I love having both. I love having both sides of the coin on this show, because I think it's really important, and the research is impressive. And I'm still conflicted. I don't know where my answer is, but I think I'll continue to evolve, because if we don't, then we're just cavemen, right?
You got that. You got that right.
Appreciate the time. Thanks for doing this.
Hey, thank you so much.
There is Daniel J. Flynn. The book is called "The War on Football: Saving America's Game."